Good morning, colleagues. Hello, everyone. Great. I would want to make sure we are all of us easy, seated down, and ready to kick off this morning. Great. I hope you had a restful night, and welcome to this conversation, this Resilience Hub, where we talk about locally led adaptation. My name is Julius Mbatia. I work with ACT Alliance as a Global Climate Justice Manager. I would want to acknowledge that we have virtual participants, so many greetings to you all virtually, and we extend a hand of greetings from COP26. And also in the room, we have quite a number of ourselves inside here, so we would want to have an engagement that is quite productive. As we, all of us know, there is a need for business unusual approaches to climate finance to deliver locally led climate adaptation. And we would want to make sure that in this conversation we engage on locally led adaptation. And the session that we will be having for 1 hour and about 40 minutes, if I am not wrong. I'm so not very good with mathematics and calculations, but bear with me on that. So the session we'll be having here is one that will allow us share experiences, successes, and challenges in accessing finance for locally led adaptation. And importantly, we will be looking at exactly what would be some of the reflections around taking forward locally led adaptation in more practical ways, including at the local level, at the community level, in a way that would make a difference for our communities that are on the front line of climate impacts. We would also definitely make sure that we are able to have discussions with interesting panelists, and we would be more than delighted to have you, including virtually, provide your feedback, your questions around the same. Oops. Sorry about that. It's a mic. It's a technical hitch. So, colleagues, we want to kickstart this day and kickstart our conversations. So, what we want to do right now is have an official, more of an opening up of an opening statement, or rather opening remarks from the LDC representative. His name is Gabriel Jeba. He will be able to probably introduce the importance of locally led adaptation, and importantly just share insights around how LDCs are taking the lead, including some of the challenges to access climate finance. We would want to give you the floor, and please take this opportunity to welcome us officially and share your experiences. Thank you very much. Welcome to the floor.
Thank you, Julius. Good morning, everyone. I'm Gabriel Jemba. I'm a technical lead for Life Here, and I'm also supporting the LDC chair as advisor, as well as I'm also supporting coordinating Article 6. First, I welcome being part of this second locally led adaptation themed session at the Resilience Hub, especially to talk about challenges, solutions, and challenges required to improve access to finance. I think it's good to start with the challenges, because we will get lesson out of it to come up with a solution. But overall, when you look at the impacts of climate change, we know that no one is immune from the impacts of climate change and variability. So in that regard, it requires the leadership from the globe as a whole. But when you look at the least developed countries, they are the most vulnerable and most impacted by the impacts of climate change and variability. As you all know, we are at a rise of 1 degree Celsius above annual mean temperature. With an increase of 1 degree Celsius, we see what's happening all over the world. So this is a clear message. When we are really setting a target of 1.5, it's not the best option. It's because we are very late in terms of acting on the ground. So, and still we're struggling to come up with a 1.5 target. So I think this is a clear message that we need to do in a holistic approach. And when it comes to adaptation, it's very critical. It's not an option. And it's a priority, it should be a priority for everyone. And it's really a priority for us as well, especially the least developed countries. And we need to scale up the adaptation finance. Just to give you a figure, the climate finance, we don't have an agreed definition on climate finance. But from sources that we found, in 2019, 15.4 billion has been mobilized or accessed by LDCs, and out of it, only 40% is for adaptation. And if you look at the aggregate need of implementation of NDCs by LDCs, we need around $40 billion. So you see there is a clear gap in terms of the amount of resource required. And in terms of the approach, of course, the business as usual way of doing things will not take us anywhere. So we need to have a kind of a whole of society approach. We need to know what capacity we have at home, what needs to be complemented by partners. That way we can sustain our intervention. And if you look at, out of all this limited resource, only 10% is reaching to the most vulnerable local communities. So that means there are a number of intermediaries in between. If we continue doing things in this business as usual way, I think we'll be kept in a vicious circle of, lack of adaptation, poverty, more vulnerability, and the cost for adaptation will be higher and higher if action is delayed. And a simple example for instance, on the GCF, nearly 81% of the finance is accessed by bigger entities. And only two having enhanced direct access. So with this approach, I think our mode of work will be very slow and will not have a really significant impact on the ground. So changes are needed. We need to do things in a business as unusual way across the value chain. So that should be the clear message. And in terms of LDC's leadership, we moved from the victim's narrative into a leadership because we believe that everyone needs to be a leader in this process. Leadership means everyone will have differentiated responsibility based on capabilities. So in this regard, we launched the LDC's vision to follow a resilient path by 2030 and net zero by 2050, which has been launched in the New York Summit in 2019. And if you look at our asks and offers, which I'm not going to get into the details, but we envisage a minimum 70% of the resource to reach to the local community, from 10 to 70. Unless we do that, I don't think that we'll move out of that circle of vicious circle of poverty. And of course, in this regard, we need a leadership by everyone and a call for the international community, including the private sector and all actors to be leaders in this process. I welcome the global momentum around the local led adaptation and the growing endorsements to the 8 principles of the local led adaptation, including the focus on increasing access to the local community, providing predictable funding, and investing to local capabilities. And these are serious and meaningful response to the LDC asks of the international community in our vision. I urge you to take those principles seriously. I encourage everyone to use the principles in a way to inspire and improve practices in your organizations to enable local action led by the most vulnerable communities. These changes is hard, but it's worth it for a brighter and better future. I also welcome the task force on access to climate finance and the intention of the UK COP26 presidency in collaboration with the government of Fiji that seeks solutions to the barriers preventing the most vulnerable countries and communities from accessing the resources that they need most. However, we need to see evidence of practical solutions that match the ambition of change set out by the LDCs. I look forward to hearing from a range of entities that have successfully accessed climate finance and those who are providing evidence or climate finance for local communities, and to see how the LDCs can replicate some of the best practices on accessing these finances, and also the task force on how they will indeed support radical improvements in access to climate finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that inspiration and also for setting the scene really well. Now, we will be having Ariana Karamalis join us virtually and making a presentation just to get to respond to a couple of questions. So what exactly are the LLA principles? What is the context? And what really happened and transpired before we got here within some of the regional dialogues that have taken place across Africa, Asia Pacific, Caribbean, and Latin America. So I would want to welcome Ariana, if you are able to hear us, but also alert us when you have been able to put up your slides. Are you there, Ariana? Can you hear us?
I am. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can. Please take the floor.
Okay. I'm Ariana Karamalis. I am joining virtually. Thank you all for having me. I work at Slum Dwellers International, which is one of the organizations that participated in the dialogues and has endorsed the LLA principles. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the global movement on locally led adaptation, including the 8 principles for locally led adaptation and the headlines from 6 dialogues on scaling up locally led adaptation that took place in September and October across Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America and the Caribbean. First, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the growing political commitment on locally led adaptation. There's been growing momentum around not only adaptation, but on locally led adaptation, where local actors, especially women, youth, children, people with disabilities, displaced people, indigenous people, and castes or racial and ethnic minority groups that have been marginalized, have agency over the design, prioritization, and or delivery of adaptation. So really, LLA is not simply when adaptation benefits are targeted at local actors, but when they're really engaged in setting the agenda and driving the adaptation solutions. Some of this momentum includes, as we just heard, the LDC's leadership commitment to get 70% of their climate finance to the local level by 2030. In addition to this, the Global Commission on Adaptation's local action track, which was championed by Sheila Patel and Dr. Mohammed Musa, led to the development of these 8 principles for locally led adaptation, which I'll go over in a moment. The importance of the principles and locally led adaptation itself has been reiterated and supported by the UK COP26 presidency, welcomed by the G7 foreign ministers, and by the Adaptation Action Coalition and Race to Resilience. In a lot of ways, this could really be called the locally led adaptation COP. So the first 4 are principles for locally led adaptation are shown here. These were launched along with the other 4 out of the Global Commission on Adaptation's local action track at the January 2021 Climate Adaptation Summit. They were co-developed with input from over 50 organizations over several years, building on empirical evidence on the value and need for local and excluded people to be at the center of building climate resilience. Over 60 organizations have now endorsed the LLA principles, including multilateral climate funds, international NGOs, bilateral donors, research institutions, and grassroots organizations. We have several of those endorsers here with us today. The first 4 principles, which, as I said, are shown here, are number 1, devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level. Number 2, addressing structural inequalities faced by women, youth, children, people with disabilities, displaced people, indigenous peoples, and marginalized ethnic groups. Number 3, providing patient and predictable funding that can be accessed more easily. And number 4, investing in local capabilities to leave an institutional legacy. The last 4, which you can see now, include building a robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty, flexible programming and learning, ensuring transparency and accountability, and collaborative action and investment. If you are interested in endorsing and joining the growing LLA community of practice and sharing your own LLA experiences, please do get in touch with IIED, who I know there's quite a few there with you all in person, or WRI. This simply includes completing in 100 words or less how you intend to put the LLA principles into practice and what change you will make to the current practice to strengthen LLA. So it was mentioned that there were quite a few dialogues that took place across, over September and October this year across all of these various countries across the world to build on the growing momentum of LLA and the 8 principles. SDI, as well as a number of other organizations, which you can see listed at the bottom here, in partnership with the COP26 presidency, the Adaptation Action Coalition, and the Race to Resilience, to delivered 6 regional dialogues on scaling up LLA across Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean. A core part of these regional dialogues has been to showcase approaches or delivery mechanisms for financing, facilitating, and governing locally led adaptation across government, civil society, and the private sector. This map shows some of the case studies shared at these dialogues, ranging from making decentralization systems work for adaptation, national climate funds and community grant mechanisms, to supporting grassroots and bottom-up led approaches for the urban poor, women's-led organizations, and indigenous peoples, to microfinance for local enterprises. In total, we've mapped over 100 approaches that are delivering locally led adaptation that clearly show that it's no longer good enough for donors to argue it is too hard to support locally led adaptation. We'll hear from some of these approaches today, as well as a few more. So just to kind of go over a few of the headlines that came out of the dialogues. So these are some of the headlines from the first round of dialogues that took place. There was a US $1 billion LLA fund call from Diane Blacklane. Devolved decision-making should be entrenched in governance models. Locally led adaptation funding time horizons need to be longer and better quality. Local people's time needs to be acknowledged rather than presuming that people can participate for free. Local and traditional and indigenous groups provide trust and networks needed to deliver effective LLA based on understanding the local political economy. Informal sector and excluded groups are underfunded despite the fact that they possess robust approaches and offer opportunities for scaling up of locally led adaptation. From the second round of dialogues, there were a few more headlines. Common enablers, strong local presence of delivery mechanisms, local networks, supporting policy and regulation, focus on building local capabilities, creating bespoke financing mechanisms, domestic financing committed to LLA, risk-taking donors, strengthen quality and quantity of funds for locally led adaptation, the need for specific funds for excluded groups, especially social movements, grassroots organizations, and those representing women, youth, children, people with disabilities, et cetera. Mainstream LLA into national policy and set LLA fiscal commitments, promote the co-creation of adaptation information and knowledge, communicate relevant national policies and regulations in local languages to reduce the barriers to engage, and put in place ambitious and locally led adaptation aligned private sector policy. Right. So just lastly, I'm going to close with this. The COP26 asks on LLA. are listed here from the LLA community. So enhanced quality and quantity of climate finance for locally led adaptation, a commitment to 25% of climate finance to be locally led and grant-based at COP26. Align all adaptation finance commitments with the 8 principles of locally led adaptation. Number 2, climate finance dedicated to groups that have been excluded. Dedicate climate finance to those groups that have been excluded from decision-making and control over resources. Co-create rules and procedures of new LLA funds and programs with local and excluded actors. Place locally led adaptation at the heart of national policies and mechanisms. Integrate local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge into adaptation, and focus on accountability, not accounting. So that is it from me. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of our panelists, and thank you all again for having me with you today.
Thank you so much, Ariana, and much thanks. Would we want to appreciate her, please, with a round of claps? Thank you so much. All the way from Glasgow for you. So we want to go into our next session and quickly want to really have what we call a fireside chat. We want to have an engagement with our panelists who would be taking us through a couple of reflections as well. So our first panelist is Dr. Mandy Barnett. She's the Chief Director of the Adaptation Policy and Resourcing Division, SANBI. And also who is joining us virtually, just to mention, our second panelist is Marianella Fioli, the Executive Director, Fundecooperación for Sustainable Development from Costa Rica. We have our third panelist who sadly has not been able to make it due to some logistical challenges, Dr. Rabbi, but we acknowledge him. He might make some intervention if he comes in time and if it's possible towards the end. And also lastly, we have Alisa Gomez, climate change analyst from the Adaptation Fund. So we would want to have this conversation with you, and within this moment, we know there's a need for business unusual approaches to climate finance. How does this relate to you in your day-to-day work? And how are you contributing to this change in view of what we need to advance locally led adaptation? I could start with you, please, and then I will go to a round.
Thank you. Hi, and I'm very pleased to be here in this hybrid event, and nice to say hi to everyone. I'm Marianella Fioli from Costa Rica. We've been working in sustainable development. We are a local NGO in Costa Rica, and we've been working in climate adaptation for more than a decade now. And we're the national implementing entity accredited to the Adaptation Fund. And we have an ongoing project for more than 6 years, just at the end of this first project for the Adaptation Fund. And we have been doing locally led adaptation and enhanced direct access for these last 6 years.
Thank you very much. Can I please go to Dr. Mandy Barnett from online? Would you want to share with us and respond to the question, the introductory question?
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to participate virtually. I'm Mandy Barnett, joining you from Cape Town in South Africa, from the South African National Biodiversity Institute. We're an entity of the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, and are the national implementing entity for the Adaptation Fund, and also a direct access entity of the Green Climate Fund. So I will share our experiences both in the context of implementing Adaptation Fund projects. Like Marianella, we've also been implementing an enhanced direct access locally led adaptation project, and also share with you how we're scaling up some of those lessons through an anticipated Green Climate Fund program of work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. Alisa.
Hello, everyone.
Sorry, we can hear you well.
Good morning, and very happy to be here representing the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund was formed under the Kyoto Protocol, and as of 2019, we've been serving the Paris Agreement. The Adaptation Fund has a unique institutional structure design where we finance projects through the direct access modality, where funding goes directly to national institutions, devolving decision-making at the local level. More recently, we've also have a new funding window called the Enhanced Direct Access that further devolves the planning, the operating, the design of projects to local organizations, local institutions, subnational governments, and civil society organizations on the ground. Happy to be here to share the Adaptation Fund insight and our experience with locally led adaptation since we were formed in 2010.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure being in such a team of colleagues and panelists. Colleagues, we appreciate that we have Adaptation Fund, which provides financing. We have also agencies which ensure that financing is channeled, but also we have agencies that actually receive the financing. Just to you, Marianela, a quick question to you is, you've accessed and probably delivered climate finance to local communities. What have been your experiences in getting these funds to the local level? And maybe you can just also touch a little bit on what principles of the locally led adaptation that you have struggled with in terms of putting them into practice.
Thank you. Yeah, and we have, I'm going to add on the principles, also on the challenges that we've got. And I think that from our experience in the last years, I mentioned we are accredited to the Adaptation Fund, and we have been trying to accredit to the GCF. So I will also mention about that. And also, we are a microfinance organization, so we have microfinance for micro enterprises in Costa Rica. One of the key messages I want to mention is that adaptation needs is urgent, is now. And I know we all share this feeling and this message, but we have to take into account that we cannot normalize that it takes in average 4 years to access climate funds. Because when the time you start up thinking about a project and when you get it executed, it's long time. I mean, many things have changed, and then you kind of have to repeat the planning. You have to do it all over again. And we're all very concerned about cost effectiveness. And I would say, take into account that if it takes 4 years of efforts on time and cost to get a project ongoing for a 4-year project, I mean, that is not cost effective. So take into account that if it cannot be normal. I mean, we cannot accept as normal issue to take almost as the same amount of time to get the funding as the implementation of the funding. So there is this urgency I want to mention. I also want to mention on the challenges of accrediting. And I know the accreditation process is important, and I want to strengthen that. But why cannot we have a standardized accreditation process? You need to go through the accreditation to the Adaptation Fund, and it's supposed to be a fast track, which is not fast, through the GCF or through and whatever. I mean, yeah, I understand that there needs to be a very good and thorough review of the trust and fiduciary requirements. Yeah, that is very relevant. But why have different processes? Why not just one? Because then that also takes cost, and we need more money going into the locally led adaptation, not into the intermediate process or all of that, getting into that. So why not the same accredit process? I also want to stress on the relevance of the role of the intermediate. We're talking about local leadership. We're talking about locally led adaptation. We need a good intermediate, which normally is the direct access or the national implementing entity that understands and addresses the needs. So but this intermediate needs also to have strengthened capacities, and is the one that would be in charge of addressing and supporting the support on the capacity building at the different levels. And you need a strong process like that. I mentioned we have enhanced direct access, and we have worked quite a lot and very good with that. And you need flexibility on that. And I think we've had great flexibility from the Adaptation Fund. We've seen that not all funds have that flexibility. You need to be flexible and adaptive to be able to learn and also scale up with your local opportunities. You cannot kind of plan that 5 years before that happens, and then you take the opportunities and then you scale it up. So we definitely need simpler access. And simpler access, I want to mention, it doesn't mean that it's not with the appropriate accountability and diligence and everything. Yeah, that needs to be happening, but let's think about cost effectiveness of the procedures.
Yeah, okay.
I'll leave it like that.
No, thank you very much for that. Dr. Barnett, just to bring you on as well, as SANBI, an intermediary as well, what has been your experience? What have been your challenges? But also, what would you say are some of the principles that we need to enhance in view of the locally led adaptation principles? Dr. Barnett.
Thank you so much. And before I respond directly to the question, I want to tell you a little story of how the Adaptation Fund's first enhanced direct access project was born, because SANBI was approved to implement the Community Adaptation Small Grant Facility, which was the Adaptation Fund's first EDA project. And it came about because when we were accredited as a direct access entity, and for those of you that are not familiar with the climate finance architecture, what that means is that SANBI as a national entity is able to access multilateral funds instead of going through multilateral intermediaries. And when we were first accredited, we convened a national workshop. And we were very excited to meet our stakeholders and explain that we were accredited for direct access. And we had some women from a rural community in the north of the country. And they said to us, what do you mean direct access if it's millions of dollars going to government? Direct access means putting the money into our projects in our communities and responding to our ideas. And it was out of that the idea of having a small grant facility was born. So, what I wanted to share today is that the principles of locally led adaptation have been very much embedded in the way that SANBI has been working since we were accredited with the Adaptation Fund back in 2011. Partly because of what we've learned from our own experience on the ground in really respecting our local partners, but also in part driven forward by the safeguards of the Adaptation Fund. And I think in that comes this complexity, because one of the challenges we really have is how do we articulate, and Marianella is touching on some of that, the high level compliance principles and regulatory environment and fiduciary standards. How do we interpret those for the local level, recognizing that they're important, and also that if they land unfiltered, they can be quite damaging. So our experience to date has been 6 years, maybe a little bit more, of implementing 2 Adaptation Fund projects. One is the Small Grant Facility project, where we supported with a number of intermediary partners, 12 grants that were roughly $100,000 each at the local level, where the grants were governed by local communities, conceptualized by local communities, driven by these communities, and lots of lessons coming out of that, that we're onboarding in a Green Climate Fund scale-up, where we're hoping to develop a new GCF project for locally led adaptation. And then our other project is led by subnational government. It's led by a municipality, where they're driving a program of work and integrating different climate drivers into the responses, and in so doing, really building the capacity of the municipality to lead and drive this work. All across our projects, there have been a number of principles that have been, I won't say completely easy, but relatively easy to integrate. So, the devolution of decision-making, we haven't got it completely right, but we've taken that on board, and there's general agreement that we need to do that. We're building the capacity of local institutions. We're investing heavily in capacity building and the building of literacy to engage with climate change, noting that very often local people know what's going on. They might not have the words. And so we need to unlock the knowledge with words that are more appropriate and more accessible for the different contexts. We've always had disaggregated indicators that focus on gender, targets, and youth, for example. We have gender targets for governance as well as local beneficiation. Our processes have been transparent. We issue calls for proposals. Everyone is able to see how the decisions are made and what we're working with. And we try to make sure that the projects are cross-sectoral and collaborative. The principles that we've struggled with the most, without question, are patience and flexibility.
Okay.
And those respond to the sort of compliance environment from which the funds flow. And I think we need to have a really in-depth conversation for how we give the funds what they need in terms of being assured that the money is being spent towards its intended purposes, but at the same time, allow there to be adaptive management and allow there to be changes at the local level that don't require cascading of governance upwards into this really complicated governance structure. There's a lot of work to be done in there, and we're hoping to onboard some of those lessons in the new Green Climate Fund proposal scale-up that I was speaking to.
Okay.
I just want to say one more point, if I may, just to say that we produced a paper for the Global Commission on Adaptation where we spoke about the missing middle. And in that paper, we recognize that in order for climate finance to meet the ground, the whole system needs to work. And I really think that focusing on the direct access actors in this missing middle is a key to us getting climate finance devolved to the ground in a way that the principles are upheld. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett, for that intervention. Coming to you, Alisa, and you work with intermediaries. And the question that I would want to pose to you is, how do you find it? What are some of the experiences, lessons in interacting with intermediaries that you can share? And then we can get into the granular bit of that as we move forward.
Sure. So, Marianela pointed out how accreditation is tough, and that's a fact. Accreditation is difficult. It's a rigorous process. But the Adaptation Fund has a readiness program where we have technical assistance grants that are given to entities. We also have a readiness package now. And so the Adaptation Fund enhances the institutional capacity of institutions. I also want to talk about the fact that in terms of patient and predictable funding, the Adaptation Fund pioneered the streamlined accreditation process, and the Micronesia Trust Fund from FSM was the first entity to acquire funding through the streamlined accreditation process. In terms of addressing structural inequalities, the Adaptation Fund has a rigorous ESB compliance process during project design. And in this process, we ensure that nobody's left behind. All communities are included during consultative processes, but also in the design of the process. And that's a very important requirement for the fund. And we've also enhanced our policies over the years. The environmental and social policy and the gender policy have been updated. And the board has, the Adaptation Fund has a precedent of changing the project templates to ensure that we have this compliance, to ensure the inclusion of the most vulnerable communities. In terms of flexible programming, the Adaptation Fund has put in place a suite of policies to enable projects to change things. So you can change certain activities up to 10% without requiring board approval. So you don't have to go through a tedious process to make changes during a project implementation. And also during the current pandemic, the board has been more flexible in terms of having COVID-related extension requests for projects, but also ensuring that this percentage is increased to 20% to make these changes that are required at a local level. When it comes to transparency and accountability, we have an open information policy. And the civil society network is involved in the review of projects as well, where they can submit their questions to the review team, and then we transmit these observations to the entities. So in this sense, we have equal participation from civil society organizations, ensuring that all those perspectives are taken into account, because they are also most aware of what's going on the ground. When it comes to locally led adaptation and the enhanced direct access approach, these non-traditional planning and execution approaches, they're time-consuming, but they also require a lot of resources. But these capacity-building measures at the local level to ensure that these communities, these organizations are able to manage their finances and manage their projects and have ownership over them are extremely necessary. So through the enhanced direct access project funding window, we've increased the percentages for the caps for the IE fees and the execution costs to ensure that the entities have the resources that they need to have this action on the ground. If I can think about a challenge, I would say definitely financing is an issue. Now we have the structures in place, we have these funding windows, we have processes, but we need the financing the Adaptation Fund has an active pipeline of about 300 million, and so this is needed.
Wow. All right. So just to come to you, Marianela, and also to Dr. Barnett, we have the ambition to make sure that people at the center of what we are working on in terms of enabling them rise above the challenges of climate change at the local level. How do you do that in practice? I mean, take us through. How do you make sure that they are actually making that decision themselves? Do you have examples of that?
That is an excellent question. We do work very closely with local organizations, and we also have a process of supporting them on going through the capacity building process and identifying and participating and identifying what are the opportunities to improve. And we also have to take into account that there is so much uncertainty on the information or on the risk, and you can think of climate risk, and then all of a sudden there is a new event, a climate event, and then the risks are totally different than what you thought. But all of that process, all of that building capacity process help them to kind of adapt on that learning, those adaptation needs. We work with more than 40 different projects within Costa Rica within this program, and more than 100 organizations, public, private, associations of producers, small scale farms, associations of little enterprises, and many of those. And all of those are more, now they have adaptation into their planning, and that already is quite a change. I want to add something that I didn't mention before, and it's the need for this enhanced direct access, because of all of that process. It's a devolving process, needs specific mechanisms, or needs that the mechanisms on the adaptation finance are different. I mean, you cannot finance LLA and enhanced direct access with the traditional mechanisms you have, because then all of the different steps, you cannot fill them out for enhanced direct access, because part of the enhanced direct access means that the activities are going to be decided when the project starts. So you cannot, there is some gap there that you need to understand, that you need, the mechanisms need to change. And that, I think, I want to mention that.
That's very useful, and thank you for that. I would want to ask Dr. Barnett to also weigh in onto that question. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks so much. And Marianela, I think your last point was quite interesting around intention and reality. So, we have an intention, for example, by the Green Climate Fund to support direct access entity adaptation projects. But in practice, we see an overwhelmingly mitigation focused pipeline. And I think our job as direct access entities is to keep pushing those barriers and to keep learning and to keep building the future that's different and showing that we can build this future that's different. So, our Adaptation Fund Small Grant Facility project taught us a lot. We had 12 grantees. There was ongoing capacity building and learning, a range of intermediaries supporting the process, particularly a level that we called facilitating agencies who really were in the field with the local beneficiary grantees the whole time, supporting them with reporting, lots of lessons around climate change and development and this false dichotomy and how we start to build a narrative for the funds that shows that we're not using the money for things that are not climate change, but climate change is about development. And how do we break through all of that? Local government support, so subnational government being involved the whole time, especially the part of subnational government that's responsible for service delivery, because that's the key to where a lot of our sustainability is. It's where our government budgets come in to provide water, to provide services. And if we can align that with the needs of local communities as they climate-proof their lives, there's a key and a clue in that around sustainability. In our bigger Green Climate Fund pipeline call, SANBI was transparent, and what we're doing for the projects that were selected through our various governance structures as the ones we will work on is we're building the capacity of the institutions to overcome the barriers that Marianela was hinting at. So it's no question about it. Accessing money from the Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund is hideously difficult, and it gets increasingly difficult as the board processes become more complicated. And we're very fortunate. Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund have both been incredibly supportive of SANBI, and in turn we're able to be supportive of our subnational partners and bring them along with the process, so they don't have to become technical experts in everything that we're needing to be technical expert in. They can focus on what they do, which is climate proofing the sectoral responses that they lead, and we can support them to access the climate finance to do that. Thanks.
Thank you for that intervention as well. And I would want to also just come back to what has been said by the conversation so far. We have a missing link somewhere. We would want a financial architecture that really thinks about the people and is wired in a way that delivers impact in a sustainable way. And by impact, I mean also finance to drive that impact at the local level in a way that is timely, that is also efficient. So back to you, Alisa. What would that look like? I mean, you work with the Adaptation Fund and you have these experiences, but let's imagine that architecture. What would that look like, and what would be useful to have in it?
I think an important thing is to find a way to formalize local inclusion in projects. And the Adaptation Fund published a study recently where we looked at 6 projects. Marinella and even Mandy's projects were among the 6 that were looked at and discussed. And something that the Adaptation Fund board might consider is finding a way to formalize the inclusion of local level actors in the project design, so that so this might be through improvements in the project templates. That could be one of the ways forward, and I think definitely for us there is a need for financing for locally led adaptation projects. The enhanced direct access window that was recently launched has a lot of demand already. So as the window, as this process progresses, learning from and in establishing learning loops from the project to inform the process further would be a key step. The Adaptation Fund is already doing this through our action pillar projects, and it will be important to do that through the new funding windows as well, to see what's working, what needs to be improved, because it's still in its pilot phase at this point.
Thank you so much for that. I love the point of formalizing inclusion of local communities intentionally, you know. And coming to you, Marianela, how would that look like from a community level, but also from an intermediary perspective? How would it look like, and what would be the things to have within such an architecture?
That is a great point. One of the issues, and I want to stress, is that if you read the 8 principles for LLA, those 8 principles, and we're happy as Fundecooperación to announce that we're endorsing those principles, and we invite everyone to endorse those 8 principles, because those principles need to be part of all of these projects. I think that we all need to think how outside the box, and try to think of, we need more quantity and quality of funding for adaptation, but we need to make sure that they are oriented in a proper way. And I think those 8 principles are definitely a good way to go.
Thank you for that. Dr. Barnett, please.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in a point that I think that direct access entities are key to overcoming the challenge of the missing middle. We've got finance that's been mobilized at the global level. It's not making its way down to the ground. And a key barrier is the ability to bring that finance into countries where local communities are able to be part of the decision-making about how it's used. And what is required for that is proper investment in direct access. And I mean direct access entities that support the principles. And there are many of us. So, you know, those direct access entities, if fully capacitated and empowered to do their work, are the key to getting this climate finance to the ground. And I think what we need to grapple with, and what the funds need to grapple with, is how do we fully support those institutions? I was recently involved in the Green Climate Fund process, where we awarded money to we've been awarded funding to develop a full funding proposal. And for Green Climate Fund projects, $1.5 million is made available just to develop a full funding proposal. What if you gave $1.5 million to a direct access entity to build its capacity? So I think we need to shake the system up. I think we're far too heavily reliant on international consultants, on multilateral entities, and I think we need to start bringing the finance into the national structures and subnational structures so that we can start to build the architecture to deliver this work.
Thank you for that response as well. I would want to open up to questions and comments and feedback to our panelists virtually first. I would want to ask Marek to help us with that. You have questions? Yeah. You have one question, actually. Okay, so let's get another mic so that we can just...
Thank you very much. So we have one question so far, so I really incentivize the virtual audience to continue asking questions, and those in the audience sitting here today, think about what your question's going to be and pop your hand up, because we have a little bit more time given we're one panelist down. So the first question is, I think for Lisa, which is you mentioned the need to formalize the inclusion of local actors in the decision-making process. So it was a question on, if that needs formalizing, what are the challenges within funds like the Adaptation Fund that are preventing that formalization from happening? So what are kind of the practical steps that might need to change to make that happen? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Please, take it on.
Thanks a lot for that question. I think from the Adaptation Fund, to formalize that, we would have to get our board to approve this process. All the project templates, everything's approved by the Adaptation Fund board. There is definitely a case for it. Our study highlights some of those, the needs to formalize these approaches. The environmental and social policy of the fund is robust enough already, but when it comes to Mandy's point about financing going to national institutions and ensuring that these local level institutions have the capacity and they are meaningfully included, having those specific requirements in a project template can go a long way in also helping the party that's formulating the proposal to already put into place some of the thinking from an early stage.
Please, Marianela, you seem like you want to add to that. Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you. I would like to add something just to take into account. I do agree that local inclusion is very important to be formalized, but I would just like to mention that if achieving that can be done, let's think about outside the box on how to achieve it and not just put it as an extra step to access finance, because it is already tedious, and then if you're adding more, now a risk analysis, now a this, I mean, you're just adding into the difficulty to access. So I'm just, you know, kind of mentioning about, I do agree on the need, but if it is possible to be done as part of the inception process or as part of when it's already ongoing the project, making sure you have it, but not just adding on to more requirements to access, because we need to reduce the difficulty to access, not just include, increase it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think Alisa again.
No, absolutely. Marinella is very right in that sense. And you know, the enhanced direct access window has that flexibility. So you have complete ownership on how you want to design that project, and so that's already there. But in our regular action pillar projects as well, some of that thinking is good to be put in place. And I think it's important to move away from single point projects to a programmatic approach. You know, even from the point of view of cost effectiveness, etc., and sustainability. So, you know, some of that thinking still needs to go in beyond, you know, a specific designated funding window.
Interesting responses there. We have another question I hear virtually. We can take that, and then we also take a round, and then we close the panel discussion as well. Please.
Thank you. So the second question was a reflection on some, I think, particularly for Fundecooperación, SANBI. There was a point around, I guess, the need to move away from international organizations channeling some of the funding. I guess there was a question on, I guess, what makes some of your national institutions who have access to funding more suitable than some of the international organizations? What makes it so hard for those international organizations to channel funding effectively to the local level, in your opinion?
Can I bring in Dr. Barnett on that, and then I also get a response from you? Sure, Dr. Barnett.
Thank you so much for the question. I want to start off by saying we do need the multilateral implementing entities. They have years of experience, and we need partnerships so that we've got capacity transfer. So I would hate to start a narrative going that says only direct access entities are needed, because clearly we need to build capacity in direct access entities to do this work. But of course, the difference is that direct access entities are located in the countries from which they are developing the projects. They live in the policy environment. Their work comes out of that policy environment. They inform and are informed by that policy environment. In our experience, SANBI has been able to build national capacity outside of the individual projects. So we're involved in a whole programmatic approach to building capacity for being able to do this climate change adaptation work in the country. It's not a single point project in out. It's much more of being part of the system, influencing it and being influenced by it. We also create bridges for new actors to become involved. So where if you're from outside the country, you need a capable local partner, we can have partners that are not that capable. This capability gets built along the way, and we're able to build that bridge and bring new actors and be transformative in that way. So I think that there's quite a lot that we can do. And the last point that I think that direct access entities bring is the ability to unlock co-finance. Because when you're aligned with the national and subnational policy environment, you also know what's going on, and you can align the impulses of programming with those national and subnational impulses and make sure that everything is pulling in the same direction. So, you know, in summary, we do need the MIEs. MIEs, please don't go anywhere, but, you know, as we've developed through some very successful partnering with the UNDP in South Africa, is we can actually work together to share this technology and make climate finance accessible for far more people.
Thank you for that reflection. I'll give you the space to respond to that question, but also just give one opportunity to a colleague from the room to ask a question or make a response, one person, and then we take the responses together as we finalize because the time is also moving.
So you were speaking about needing one accreditation process for the Adaptation Fund and the GCF, and I'm wondering whether the panel can just reflect on how that might work.
Thank you for that quick one. I'll allow you, please. You can ask one question. Her hand went up when the mic was given out already. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought it was also really interesting that you're reflecting on the kind of long time periods that it takes to access, but then simultaneously about this kind of moving away from single projects to a more programmatic approach. And I wonder if you'd both just explain a bit more about what you mean by a programmatic approach and how that kind of practically works, and also from Mandy online as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You too. Okay, have the honors because you've helped us with the mic.
Just try and slip one in while I still have the mic. In terms of what you were mentioning about having more innovative accreditation processes, oftentimes community groups aren't able to get accredited just because they don't meet the requirements. So for the panel, what would you think in terms of community groups being able to join in joint ventures with either NGOs or private sectors and share that accreditation burden and sort of play to each other's strengths, really?
Great. So we have 3 questions. I would want all of you to reflect on them, but also as you finalize your reflection on each question, just give us your key takeaway. What is that one thing that we must do moving forward in view of LLA? And all right, so we would have to start with Marianela. You look so ready for all that.
Thank you. To reflect on the accreditation that I mentioned, I mean, the fiduciary requirements are very similar. So it doesn't make sense that they need to go through different teams of reviewing of pretty similar requirements. So going through a process of standardizing the requirements and kind of like doing a one-shop accreditation process that would really simplify the lives of everyone, and I'm sure it would reduce a lot the costs for, processing cost of all of these agencies anyway. So I think everyone would win from that, and I really think that that would be very a great step. On the programmatic approach, our program is, I mentioned it has like 40 different projects ongoing, all related to one planning that it's really, for instance, working on adaptation on the agro sector with these priorities and with these focus. So we, as part of and adding on Mandy made very great points.
Yeah.
Adding on the direct access would be also making sure that we have synergy among these projects and these executing entities, and that in a way is also developing the local capacity, and developing the local capacity is ensuring also long-term sustainability of the actions, not just depending on specific things. Mm-hmm. And my takeaway is we need really to think that adaptation finance is urgent. We need it now. We need more, but we also need to think outside the box on how to make it more cost efficient. And I think that we definitely need that.
Thank you so much for that reflection, Alisa.
One quick thing, for those entities that find it at the subnational level, looking for finance and to finance smaller scale projects that might be innovative in nature, the Adaptation Fund Climate Innovation Accelerator, administered by UNDP and UNEP CTCN, has the capability to finance these novel ideas and these projects. And the range of sectors that can be covered under these programs are much wider. And so there are opportunities available, and understanding that accreditation is a long process and it's a rigorous process for a reason. And so I would defer from commenting on how this might be streamlined between the funds. But on to your point, Clara, on the programmatic approach to what Marinella said, we're looking at clusters of smaller scale projects, and they all have a common outcome, but there could be sub-objectives, and dispersing risks within these smaller clusters is another approach. Some of our projects we have a number of projects that have small grants programs within the components, and these are good ideas to really source out local ideas and to build ownership at the local level.
Great. Please, Dr. Barnett, online, we give you the space in 1 minute to respond as well.
Sure. I just want to respond to one of the points, and that is this issue about everybody wanting to become accredited. And my advice is don't. I think we need to recognize that different organizations play different roles in the overall system. And we should let those organizations become expert at what they do, and allow others to be expert at what they do. So, for example, in South Africa, we are absolutely convinced that we need another fund or a fund that is focused on locally led adaptation. And our job as the SANBI direct access entity will be to create that. We're hoping to execute it through intermediaries who are existing grant makers and who know how to work with communities and know how to do what they do best. So I think it's about us all looking at our ecosystem, if we're wanting to use a biodiversity term, and looking at the different niches and roles that everybody plays, and seeing how we can complement each other and allow us to become expert at navigating things like the fund fiduciary standards, and figuring out a way to interpret those so that when the finance lands on the ground, it's gentle sprinkling rain and not a big tornado event. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you for that good and insightful session. Please, a round of applause for our colleagues. Great. I would welcome you to take your seats, and we get into this other part of the conversation as well. So we want to have a conversation with Vel, who is the Climate and Environment Director, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK government. And we would want to check with him first whether he's able to come to the floor, and and please take a seat up front. Yes, well, please just go down. Yeah. You're not very alone, I'm also here, so we share the stage. You wanted to come here. Welcome, Val. We want to, with everyone else in the room and also colleagues virtually, just get to check a bit of things around providing action-oriented, accountable reflections on what the COP26 presidency and the task force actually is doing and can do and is aiming at doing to make sure that finance gets to the local level, to the local communities. So just to kick us off, Vel, what will the task force do to address some of the issues that have been raised? And I'm so excited that you were part of this room when this conversation was happening with the previous panels. Please. Sorry, I know it's not on. Yeah, just press the button.
Is that working?
Great.
Cool. Well, look, morning everybody, and thank you, Julius. Thanks for chairing this great session. And thank you to the panelists. I learned so much just by listening here, so thank you to the panelists. I will answer your question, Julius, but I just wanted to reflect a bit on what Gebru said at the very beginning. So at the moment, we don't have enough climate finance, right? We set the goal of 100 billion by 2020. We know that in 2019, we're at 80 billion. So actually, we're not getting enough climate finance, full stop. There's not enough going to adaptation, so it's about 25% in 2090, £20 billion. Of that, there's not enough going to LDCs and vulnerable countries. I can't remember the percentage, but we know it's small. And of that, only 10% gets to local levels. So if you imagine a funnel and you're putting the water in the top, how much is getting to the bottom? And then Marianella, it takes 4 years to get from the top to the bottom, right? So I think this conversation for me is really about how you reduce, well, two things. One, how do you widen the top of the funnel, so more going in, and widen the bottom, so that more goes in at the top and more comes out at the bottom. And that really is the conversation I think we're having. And I think we've heard a lot about different ways of doing that. There's value of intermediaries, but there's also value in direct access. There's value in harmonization, and every institution has value, whether it's the GCF, the AF, whatever. They all have value, but at the same time, we always need to learn. Every organization can improve, so I think this sort of feedback is really good. And the task force sort of does try to collect some of that feedback and replay it to some of those other institutions. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that there's a kind of big challenge there about opening up the whole space. So if I just then get to your question about the task force. So, I mean, the task force actually builds on a lot of this conversation. Again, it's not the whole answer. That's why I wanted to say every institution has value, and what the task force is really trying to do is to say, how do you get financing to local levels at scale and faster? And it tries to draw on some of the lessons from wider development effectiveness. So, as our colleague from South Africa said, putting funding directly into government budgets or into government systems. Also going to the programmatic approach. And I just wanted to pick up on your question, I think, about what is a programmatic approach. Like, for me, it's not actually an umbrella of projects. That, for me, is just a lot of different projects put together. It's actually about taking a sort of a large-scale effort. It could be a nationwide effort over a long time frame. So when I was the ex-STIFID country director in Tanzania, we were running a project with a program with the government, where the government was running a rural roads project. It was building roads in rural areas across the whole country, and it wanted to make those roads climate resilient. So we were then supporting that aspect of that program. So it was government-wide, it was one system through the government's budget. And so that really is when I think about programmatic approach, and when we think about that through the task force, it's very much those kind of very high scale, was that the right word? Large scale, long-term, with sort of one outcome. And so I just wanted to be really clear, because what my worry is, if it's lots of projects, every time you want to do a $10 million project or 50, you have to go back through the process with the accreditation and the funding and then, I mean, we'll be here forever if that's, so I think that's how I perceive the task force as filling a different, there's value in that. I don't want to say there's no value in that. The task force is about something different. It's when you're looking at a scalable nationwide thing, how do you get funding to flow quickly through a government system?
Yeah, interesting. And we've had conversations with the other panelists on exactly what transformation is required within the current architecture and the current modalities to make sure that we make what you're saying, expanding the local level space to access financing, but also making sure that we increase the financing at the same time. So how do we want to build, and how do you want to build within the task force this new transformative, quotes in quotes, regime with countries that are vulnerable? How do we incorporate voices from the community level in terms of providing and that space to co-create this locally led adaptation financing and make it possible?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, Julius, because as you go, it's hard. This is really hard to do, right? Particularly at national level, national governments to kind of get community voices into the formation of national policy and then get money. It's quite hard. I mean, it's hard at every level, no matter what capacity. So it's a really important question. I mean, the UK with Ireland and a number of other donors are part of something called LIFE-AR, the Least Developed Countries Initiative for Effective Adaptation Resilience, which is about how you integrate local voices, community voices into national planning structures, and then how you make sure the financing flows through that. So that's just one way of which you try to marry, if you like, national planning processes with bottom-up community voices, and then make sure the funding goes through. But there are lots of other ways of doing it. I think one thing I would say is it takes time, takes a lot of time to get government systems to work like that. Capacity is not always strong at the local level, so that there needs to be a lot of work to build that capacity up. But actually, when you can do it, as we all know, the best solutions are often locally led, and that's what the principles are about, but also they last longer. And if I may, Julius, one thing I'd say, the task force doesn't do capacity building itself. It's not about that. It will leverage all the other institutions, what the Adaptation Fund does, what LIFE-AR does, what NDCP does. So it's all about using what's out there already to try and just bring it together in a more systematic way.
Interesting. So I'm looking forward to what exactly happens within the task force. And as I look forward, I have so many of us from the world doing the same. So are we going to see some well thought out insights and also perspectives around locally led adaptation as well?
I hope so. Well, you'll see it. It should get published today, and there's an event later today, I think 4:30, where we will announce the recommendations of the task force and also have the first countries. I mean, I won't pretend, Julius, that the task force has got all the answers. These are complicated problems that if they were easy, we would have solved them a long time ago. We have to keep I can't remember, one of the speakers talked about learning and kind of constantly learning, and I think with the task force that's certainly been the approach. We will start this small, we know it's not been done at scale before, and learn and then grow it as we learn.
Interesting. I would want to also ask the panelists who just came from the floor here to reflect on what you have said, Val. What are your thoughts? I mean, are you looking forward to engaging with him and with the task force? What exactly would be your messages and your desires, of change? And I'll come also to you, Dr. Barnett, online in a few. Marianela, no, let's just with you.
Well, I think it's great to hear your message. I totally agree on the need to move and to have a different focus. I also like, I'm going to be looking forward to that announcement on 4:30 that you're going to do, and I totally agree on that learning process that all of us are learning and all of us are focusing. But yeah, we need to shift and move. So it is great to hear on what you're saying. I hope the task force actually does, as part of that learning process, also kind of generates change and movement. I hope that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Interesting. Alisa?
Yes, also definitely looking forward to your message. And I also agree about the fact that you mentioned taking a wider approach, almost a more systemic approach to this. And to second what Carolina said, what Marinella said about learning, we learn as we go and we adapt.
Great. Barnett, Doctor, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, from me, it's really just to say thank you for taking the time to listen and to reflect. I think we need more of that in the system. It seems that the COP is full of lots of people messaging, but not a whole lot of taking in. And I look forward to seeing how some of what you've reflected back is translated into practical interventions.
Interesting. And let me just also take it up from what she said. Is translated into practical interventions. So how would that be done? How would that look like? What is your opinion? Your opinion.
Absolutely. I think one of the big messages we're going to get out of this COP is how kind of we get to kind of commitment to action. So later on today, we'll also announce the pilot countries that are going to take forward this. Now, one of the strongest messages from the task force is that this is not about top-down solutions. So I can't tell you now what this is going to look like, because that should be driven by the countries, by the communities. And so part of that learning process is how you source that, get that process working so that locally led voices on adaptation are shaping national policy priorities, and then funding is coming behind that. Not the other way around, where I'm sat here in Glasgow deciding what a community in Zambia or whichever country should be done. That is totally not what should be happening. And the task force is very much about how we have country-driven priorities that are funded by the international system.
Thank you for that. That's very interesting. Is there anyone who would want to have a conversation with Val? I mean, I'm opening up the floor to one person in the room and who feels inspired enough to talk and have an engagement. Great. We have one from the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Drew Corbin. I work for GOGLA, the Off-Grid Solar Energy Industry Association. And we've been looking at the 700 million people around the world that don't have access to electricity. We're saying for them, the best solution in many cases is off-grid solar for houses, for farmers, for enterprises, for schools and clinics. And this can help them develop, but also to become more resilient and adapt to climate change. And it's a market that's, we estimate it's about $20 billion of climate investment opportunity, and a mix of concessional and commercial capital. So, private and public finance. At the moment, no adaptation funds goes to this sector. And we're looking to try and map the investors and understand how we can channel investment in. So it's both, public investment and private investment. From the adaptation funds we've seen, it's all public, more or less. And it's all, like you say, it's kind of goes from the wide funnel down to the drips at the local level. And it takes too long. So, we're kind of looking around and say, is this an opportunity, or are these barriers too much and we're best going elsewhere? So, yeah, how can a sector like ours access adaptation funds in this mix of public and private in a timescale that's interesting for companies and the people they serve?
That's an interesting one. Please.
Yeah, no, first of all, I think Gogla does amazing work. And the kind of the growth in the off-grid solar market's just been huge and has transformed so many lives. And I've definitely seen that in the various countries I've worked in. So thank you to you and all the work that you've done. So I actually think that's a different set of problems, which we can have a whole separate conversation about. But how adaptation finance leverages and mobilizes private capital is a really interesting challenge. And generally speaking, when you look at climate finance numbers, public finance is overwhelmingly adaptation, and the leverage, the mobilization of public finance is quite low, because adaptation interventions generally don't generate financial returns, and therefore you're not able to bring in non-concessional finance. So that how you can bring other money that's not national government money into adaptation solutions is a big challenge, and we need to solve that challenge. The task force isn't sort of going directly at that problem. It will come at it indirectly, I think, to the degree that if a government were to decide that a key part of how they want to solve problems, and the communities are talking to them about energy access, SDG 7, as a priority, and then the government decides to respond to that and articulate that in its priorities, then I think that's something the task force could respond to and work with in terms of its own, working with the government's priorities. But I still think there's a bit of a problem in that. That would probably still be mitigation. I'm not sure that would still, I mean, you start to get into all the Rio markers and it's a difficult conversation. I don't exactly know where that takes you, but I just think the immediate answer to your question is the government would need to articulate that as a priority. Whether that's mitigation or adaptation, I don't know. I'm not sure. It could be, and it is, right? It makes a community more resilient. But I also am not sure how valuable that bit of the conversation is, because what matters is that the government has, and the community has articulated that priority and it's financed.
Thank you for that. We have one virtual question as well. We would want to have you respond to that also. Please, Merrick.
Thank you. So the one virtual question for Vel was, I guess, a bit of a thought process on how is the task force going to try and advance, particularly in line with the 8 principles for locally led adaptation, how those who have previously been excluded from not just adaptation but development practice, how are we going to advance including them within national but also local adaptation planning and implementation processes, particularly in the context of many countries that are dealing with also conflict and their maybe potential fragile states, and it's incredibly difficult to do that. What's the intended direction and journey to try and make that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, there are some of the 8 principles that are almost hardwired into the recommendations of the task force, which you will see later, I hope, although the draft ones are already out. So things like predictability, things like flexibility, some of those principles are already, because they're standard, long-standing development effectiveness principles, so they're transparency, a lot of those are already built into the recommendations of the task force. I do think how you get local voices, how you make sure you are not generating maladaptation, so you're addressing the fundamental drivers of injustice and vulnerability, is really difficult. This is the most complicated thing we can do in any country. And I think we're going to have to, we've talked about it, we're going to have to learn. And there are multiple organizations, Marianelle, yours, that have long experience of doing this. And we need to find ways of amplifying those voices and bringing them into national policy conversations. And I don't think the task force is going to today tell us all, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries, how to solve those, partly because it's going to be different in every country and it's going to be different in every community. But what it's going to try and do is open up the space in the international climate finance system to start pushing that kind of, to start challenging the international climate finance system to answer those questions, and drawing on the best practice that we currently have.
Thank you so much for that reflection and the responses and the questions as well. I would want to ask that we appreciate you. So many thanks for the opportunity to engage with you. Please. You can take the floor. Take your seat.
Thank you, Julius.
Much welcome. Colleagues, it's been an interesting moment of engaging and discussing and reflecting, but also building and painting a picture of what exactly it is that we are aiming at in terms of locally led adaptation. And I have the honor to just close this session, but also summarize a bit of what has come out. I have not taken notes. Please do not refer to my notebook. These are not notes. These are just points. But interesting perspectives around how do we formalize inclusion from the word go? So we are intentional about it, but also how do we make sure that the institutions and structures at the local level are fit for delivering adaptation that is required by communities. So that is a structural conversation, an institutional, I would call and quote it, revolution conversation that we must have. At the same time, that would mean we need to widen the scope at the local level in terms of institutions with the capacity to work with communities and address the needs of communities at the local level. So that's a conversation on its own also, but importantly, how do we make sure that we have a facilitative process, an enabling environment at both the subnational level but also the national level to ensure that actors are coming together and building synergy but also collaborating around advancing locally led adaptation. And then we also had a bit of conversation around the intermediaries and how we would want to see them work with international partners, including multilateral funds, but importantly, how that collaboration can be fit for purpose. So everybody has got their own space. All of us have a space to make climate change actions work for the people, but how do we then make that space useful for all of us, but also importantly, useful for those most vulnerable at the local level. We also had a conversation around also how we would, I like this term, widen the top of the funnel, right? And by that, we would make sure that we have financing at scale for adaptation, importantly, that responds to the needs of the local level and the local communities and vulnerable communities. So this is a very interesting conversation. We've also had some aspiration sharing around what the task force, quotes in quotes, should. I'm quoting some of these terms, quotes in quotes, should deliver. And thank you so much for that conversation as well. But also importantly, what I would say is this has been that kickstarting conversation around how we want to repurpose, redesign, and focus our financial architecture to the local communities. Thank you so much, colleagues. It's been a pleasure moderating this session, and a round of applause to all of us for coming, and many thanks. Thank you so much.